This is part two in answer to the great question, how to think rightly about educating our children. So in our first segment, I suggested that the key to thinking about this is the ancient understanding of education as the formation of the whole person. So taking that as our starting point, I think a really great thing to do is then to turn to an insight into human nature. If we're going to educate the whole person, we need to look at what the whole person is. Plato and Aristotle make a fundamental division in human life, in the human soul, between, we can call it two kinds of powers. Powers of desiring and powers of knowing. In the scholastic philosophy language, this is a distinction between apprehension or knowing on the one hand and appetite on the other. Appetite is the realm of desire, of passion, of love. So formation of the whole person really is going to go in two directions. It needs to take into account that fundamental dichotomy in human life. Now, when I say dichotomy there, these two areas are deeply interwoven. How you know, how you love, are very much feed into one another. Nonetheless, it's a very helpful distinction to kind of separate. We can think of forming each, while forming the one always is going to have an influence on the other. Nonetheless, it's a helpful way to separate out two aspects, two key areas of the formation of human persons, and here we're especially focusing on the young. Now, when we are thinking about the young, there's something about focusing on desire or appetite first. So this segment here is going to be, let's think about education, especially through the lens of forming the desires of people, forming the desires here, especially of the young. And a neat aspect of that is this, the young, all of their powers are immature, but you especially notice it's hard to reason with them. In a sense, their appetites are going full bore, but their reason is, in varying degrees, not very well engaged yet. So it's almost like we need to see this and recognize we should more direct our attention to forming their desires, their passions, their loves. I'm not saying neglect the realm of age-appropriate ways. We can explain things. There's always a time for explaining. Nonetheless, here, there's much to be seen, I think, is already a real key that we tend not to think in terms of, but there's a great gem in our tradition, forming appetite. Indeed, Plato and Aristotle together say, what I should say is, Plato said it, then Aristotle, at a key moment in his own ethics, quoted this great line from Plato, where he said, the fruit of education is a person who has pains and pleasures in the right way. And what that means is it's pains and pleasures, especially has to do with appetite, kind of what pains us, what gives us delight, what draws our heart to it. Well, Aristotle focuses us there on, a man by where his heart is. So one way of just summing up the point of education is forming the heart. So here's the suggestion. How are we forming the heart? Something that we don't think about so much, but I want to front load this. Now I want to give you a key principle from the wise about human desires and how there are higher human desires. There are higher human goods. I'm going to call those spiritual goods with the wise. And here's a key assertion they make. I think it's an astounding insight. The higher goods, though much more intrinsically desirable and delightful, are, especially to the inexperienced, less appealing. And they say, especially until we've tasted them, and through that tasting of them, start to get to know them, they tend to just not appeal to us. They don't engender a desire in us. Don't we see this in children? They're very much attracted to the things that are more just right there to be had. The sweet smelling thing, the great tasting thing, the things that appeal to their senses, the things that take more cultivation. The higher goods are more remote from them and don't really come onto their radar. So a key thing in training them is to bear this point in mind, exposing them to the higher goods, giving them a taste of it. Because the more they've begun to taste the higher goods, / we can call them spiritual goods, the more then they'll, through that tasting, get a further taste for it. They'll start to have a familiarity, and they'll start to be moved by it in a way that ultimately will be a much deeper kind of moving than the way the material delights, the bodily delights move them. But that takes much effort. So they're, of course, in training then the appetites, to focus on that, training the appetites. Remember, to train the appetites, the desires, is also to be training their mind at the same time. Though we can also talk about training their mind separately. But training their appetites will, of course, have a negative side. Saying no to a number of things. So I think that's kind of obvious. I'm not going to linger over that. But we're going to have to be willing to be strong and courageous in giving directions and saying no, because that's just the appetites of the young tend to go towards things, maybe simply bad things or good things, that they go towards too much. That's going to have to be reined in. But the thing that so often is missed is the positive side. Training their desires, their taste, by thinking, being very intentional about how to get them to taste the higher things. So, again, here's the heart of the project. Introducing them to the spiritual goods to give them a real taste for it. This is what the household is especially designed to do. Think of a couple examples. Times around the fire. Sitting around the dinner table. A birthday party. Celebrating Easter together. Going outside for a walk together. These are things that are kinds of activities that are particularly characteristic of a household, and they can be shot through with spiritual goods. Now remember, as humans, spiritual goods are pretty much always incarnated. They're experienced in and sometimes through material things. So it's not as though we just leave all the material behind. I'm just going to go up for simply spiritual things. No, particularly for children, very rich spiritual things are at hand in and through the material things, such as, again, sitting around the fire. There's a key material element, but the kind of personal connection that happens there, that's a profound spiritual good. Same about being around the dinner table together. If it's done in an intentional way, the great tasting food is a key aspect. But what's much more important is the deeper personal communion that's happening there. The kind of affirmation at a birthday party that can happen, the kind of love that's felt, the celebration of life in your existence, in and through perhaps some good cake. But to be focusing and intentional on cultivating, giving them a taste for those things. 2 quick suggestions. Plato and Aristotle, they focus on this a lot in their thinking about the education of young. Good stories, good music. And through good stories and good music, we taste spiritual goods. You know what comes to mind in the good stories? Of course, stories of saints, heroic men and women. I was just reading Cicero the other day, and he tells the story of, there were 2 disciples of Pythagoras. They were great friends with one another, and the tyrant condemned to death one of the disciples, one of the friends. And he needed to go and arrange things at home before he got executed, but he wasn't going to be allowed to do that. So the friend comes and he goes to the tyrant and says, will you please allow me to stay in the jail while my friend goes and he takes care of things. If he doesn't come back, you can kill me. Tyrant agrees to it. The friend goes, takes care of his things, and he comes back. And the tyrant was so moved by this that he said, you know what? I'm going to set you free. I want to learn how to have a kind of friendship like you all have. This is a great story. This gives a taste for something that makes the soul soar. So it's just an example of tasting it. Great music, Bach, Mozart. The soul soars. This can be cultivated together. These things, these are education. This isn't just, oh, well, that's kind of nice, that's cute. This is what the great thinkers thought was essential, especially to the education of the young. Show me a man, an 18-year-old young man, who will look me in the eye, who knows how to stand tall, who's polite, who'll take responsibility, whom I can trust with my daughter. This is a man who's been educated. Maybe he knows calculus, maybe, but that's not the key issue. Education, forming a whole human person. Next segment, we'll talk about academics.